Jerome Wade was 41 years old, and until that rainy Tuesday night in Cincinnati, his wife believed she knew exactly what he was worth. He was a project manager with a modest salary, a work truck, and a joint checking account with $340 in it. Priya had done the math. She had already spoken to a lawyer, already changed the locks, already planned where Jerome's garbage bags would sit in the garage he couldn't access. She had spent 14 months building her exit, while sleeping in the same bed as the man she was robbing. So when Jerome pulled into his own driveway that night, and she opened the door 4 inches, chain on, fully dressed, completely composed, she felt certain she had already won. She told him to leave. She closed the door. And Jerome stood in the rain outside a house he owned, next to an oak tree he had planted with his own hands, holding nothing. What Priya never thought to ask, not once in 9 years, was where that second phone came from, or whose name was on the black car that pulled up 2 minutes later. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Jerome's windshield wipers swept back and forth in a steady rhythm as he navigated the dark Cincinnati streets. The rain created a soft drumming on the truck's roof, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort after long days on job sites. 11 days in Columbus had been productive, the kind of work that left a man tired in the right ways, knowing problems had been solved and things had been built properly. His work truck, a deliberately ordinary Ford F-150, handled the wet roads with familiar reliability. Like everything else in his visible life, the truck served its purpose without drawing attention. It was the vehicle of a working project manager, nothing more and nothing less. Just as his father had taught him, tools were meant to work, not shine. The digital clock on the dashboard read 10:47 p.m. Traffic had thinned to occasional passing headlights, and the streets were growing quieter as he made his way through familiar neighborhoods. His thoughts drifted to home. Not just the house, but the specific details that made it his. The oak tree he'd planted 7 years ago was growing strong and straight, its roots reaching deep into Ohio soil. He'd chosen that specific spot in the front yard carefully, calculating decades of growth into his decision. Jerome did everything that way, with patience and precision. His marriage to Priya had started the same way. 9 years of building something he thought was solid. She brought polish and charm to their life, while he provided the steady foundation. At least, that's how it had been in the beginning. Lately, there had been subtle shifts he'd noticed but hadn't allowed himself to fully examine. Small changes in routine, slight alterations in tone, tiny variations that most men might miss, but that Jerome, with his trained eye for structural changes, couldn't help but register. Jerome reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his work phone, the one Priya knew about, the one that matched his visible life. His other phone, sleeker and newer, stayed secured in his inner pocket, where it had always been, unknown to her. Some things weren't meant to be shared until the right moment. Another lesson from his father. He dialed Priya's number, watching the rain-slicked road ahead as the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, then voicemail. Her recorded voice, warm and professional. "You've reached Priya Wade. Please leave a message." Jerome ended the call without leaving one. He noted the lack of response the same way he'd note a hairline crack in a foundation, something to be observed and factored into larger calculations, but not reacted to emotionally. The neighborhood streets became more familiar as he turned onto his own block. The houses here were solid middle-class homes, well-maintained but modest. His house sat halfway down the street, a 2-story colonial that normally welcomed him with warm exterior lights. Tonight, though, the house was dark. The timer-controlled lights that had functioned perfectly for years were off. He pulled into the driveway, the truck's headlights sweeping across the garage door. Reaching for his key fob, Jerome pressed the button for the garage door opener. The small LED flashed red. Code not recognized. He tried again. Same response. Moving with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions, Jerome stepped out into the rain. He walked to the side door, key in hand. The deadbolt had been thrown from inside. The front door yielded the same result. Jerome knocked, his knuckles making a solid sound against the wood. He waited, rain soaking into his jacket. When no response came, he knocked again. Harder this time. The porch light snapped on, sudden and harsh. He heard footsteps inside, then the sound of the chain being drawn across its track. The door opened 4 inches, revealing Priya's face. She was fully dressed, her makeup perfect, her expression composed in a way that spoke of rehearsal rather than surprise. She had been waiting. "I changed the locks this afternoon," she said, her voice steady and practiced. "Your things are in the garage. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I need you to leave." "What is happening?" Jerome asked, his voice level despite the rain running down his face. Priya's response was simple, final. "I need you to go, Jerome." The door closed with a soft click. Jerome stood motionless, rain falling steadily around him. His work truck sat in the driveway. His bag held his laptop and work document. The joint account Priya knew about contained $340. These were the visible pieces of his life, the ones she had calculated into her plans. Jerome turned slightly, looking at the oak tree he'd planted. Its branches moved gently in the rain, strong and rooted. Then, with the same quiet precision that marked everything he did, he reached into his jacket and removed his second phone. He made a single call. "Go ahead and bring it around," he said softly. He ended the call and stood at the end of his driveway, hands loose at his sides, waiting in the rain, as though this moment had always been part of a larger blueprint. 2 minutes passed like water flowing over stone, steady, measureless, inevitable. Jerome stood motionless at the end of his driveway, the rain settling into his clothes with the same patience he'd inherited from his father. Each drop was a timer counting down to something Priya hadn't calculated. Headlights appeared at the top of the street, their beams cutting through the rain with deliberate grace. The vehicle moved unhurried, like something that had never needed to prove its worth. As it drew closer, its form became clear. A Rolls-Royce Cullinan, completely blacked out from its massive grille to its tinted windows. The vehicle was a statement written in shadows and chrome, every line engineered to command respect without demanding it. The Cullinan pulled smoothly to the curb in front of Jerome's house. Even at rest, it seemed to hover above the wet pavement, its presence transforming the modest suburban street into something else entirely. The young driver, Marcus, who Jerome had hired 3 months ago through a separate LLC, stepped out with practiced efficiency. He moved to the rear door and opened it without a word, holding it with the precise angle and posture that spoke of professional training. Jerome walked to the car with the same measured steps he used on construction sites, each movement deliberate and grounded. He settled into the rear seat, and Marcus closed the door with a sound that wasn't so much a click as a whisper of precision engineering. The interior embraced Jerome like a familiar room. Dark, honey-colored leather wrapped every surface, hand-stitched and perfect. The cabin was completely silent, sealed against the rain and the world outside. Climate control had already created the exact temperature Jerome preferred. This was his space, ordered to his specifications 8 months ago, registered to an LLC Priya had never heard of, maintained with the same quiet attention he gave to everything that mattered. Jerome's personal phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen showed a message from Uncle Darnell, his father's younger brother, who'd spent 30 years as a financial advisor in Louisville before retiring. The man who'd taught Jerome that money, like anything else worth building, required both patience and precision. "She did it tonight?" Darnell's text was direct, concerned. Jerome typed back, "Tonight." The response came immediately. "You all right?" Through the Cullinan's tinted windows, Jerome watched his house, the lights moving from room to room as Priya walked through spaces she thought she now controlled alone. He thought about the documents waiting on his laptop, the careful legal architecture he and Phyllis had been constructing since Darnell's warning call 8 months ago. "Better than she thinks," he replied. Marcus navigated downtown Cincinnati's rain-slicked streets with smooth competence. The Cullinan moved like a shadow through traffic, drawing the kind of attention that came with darkness rather than flash. They pulled into the private garage entrance of one of the city's most discreet luxury hotels, the kind of place that understood the value of privacy and charged accordingly. The suite occupied the entire top floor, accessed by a dedicated elevator that required both a keycard and a code. Jerome had maintained the space through another LLC for the past 6 months, one more piece of preparation Priya had never suspected. The monthly cost exceeded what she believed he made in a week. Inside, Jerome moved through familiar motions. The shower's pressure was perfect, the water temperature exactly right. In the suite's walk-in closet, a full wardrobe waited. Suits, casual wear, everything selected and maintained with the same attention to detail that marked every aspect of his hidden life. Clean and changed, Jerome sat at the desk and opened his laptop. The screen illuminated with documents that represented 8 months of careful legal preparation. Phyllis Okafor's work was, as always, meticulous. Each file represented a different aspect of Jerome's actual financial life. The 11 properties spread across Cincinnati, Columbus, and Dayton, the silent partnership in the commercial development firm, the trust his father had left him, $1.4 million that had grown to $4.2 million through patient, precise investment. Jerome reviewed each document with the same focus he gave to structural engineering reports. Nothing rushed, nothing missed, nothing left to chance. The complete picture was clear and clean, every asset protected, every legal foundation solid, every detail accounted for. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, Jerome looked out over the nighttime city. Lights sparkled through the rain like stars brought down to earth. Somewhere out there, his properties stood quiet and profitable. His investments moved with the same patient certainty that had guided every decision since his father's passing. He thought about the oak tree, standing strong in the rain. Then Jerome went to bed, lying down with the same deliberate calm that had carried him through the evening. There was no restlessness in his movements, no anger in his breathing. Only the quiet certainty of a man who had seen the structural weakness long ago and had built accordingly. Jerome woke at his usual time, 5:30 a.m., his body operating on the same internal clock that had governed his life for decades. The suite's blackout curtains held back the dawn, but he opened them immediately, letting Cincinnati's morning light fill the space. The city below was already stirring, moving with the steady rhythm he'd always appreciated. He ordered breakfast through the hotel's private service, steel-cut oats, fresh fruit, black coffee. While waiting, he dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that had hung unworn in the suite's closet for months. The suit, like everything else in this space, belonged to a version of Jerome Wade that Priya had never bothered to look for. At his laptop, Jerome reviewed the complete financial picture one final time. The numbers were exactly as they had been for months, each asset carefully documented and legally protected. 11 properties across 3 cities, held in separate LLCs. The silent partnership in the commercial development firm that had completed 4 successful projects in the past 6 years. The trust his father had left him. $1.4 million that Jerome had grown to $4.2 million through patient, precise investment. Phyllis Okafor arrived exactly at 9, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 8 months of careful legal preparation. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where precision determined outcomes. Her handshake was firm, her expression focused. "Everything is in position," she said, setting her files on the table. "The response is prepared, the financial disclosure is complete, and the forgery documentation is ready for the prosecutor's office. Jerome nodded, pouring coffee for both of them. Walk me through the sequence one more time. Phyllis opened her primary file. When you give the word, we file the divorce response with the complete financial disclosure. Your wife's attorney filed this divorce expecting a marital estate under $700,000. The house, the joint account, your apparent salary. The disclosure will reveal $4.2 million in separate property that was correctly structured and maintained throughout the marriage. They have no claim on any of it. And the Avondale property? That's where it gets interesting. Phyllis pulled out a separate document. The forged transfer paperwork they filed, suggesting you'd signed over the 6-unit property to her LLC, is clear fraud. The forensic comparison with your legitimate signatures is definitive. When this goes to the prosecutor's office, it creates serious criminal exposure. Jerome sipped his coffee, thinking about the Avondale property, one of the first his father had bought, maintained meticulously for 30 years, passed down with the same care that had marked everything in Jerome Wade Sr.'s life. The fact that Priya had tried to take it through forgery was a particular kind of betrayal. 8 months, Jerome said quietly, since Darnell called about seeing them in Louisville. Your uncle did you a service, Phyllis noted. That warning gave us time to build this properly. Every asset is protected, every document is in order, and every legal foundation is solid. When this hits, it hits all at once. Jerome stood, walking to the window. Hold the filing for a few more days. I need to complete the investigation into Victor's professional conduct before we trigger everything simultaneously. Understood. Phyllis began gathering her files. The documents are ready. When you give the word, everything moves within the hour. Jerome walked her to the door, thanking her with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown since their first meeting 8 months ago. Once she was gone, he returned to the window, looking out over the city he'd quietly built a significant stake in, while maintaining the appearance of a simple project manager. He pulled out his phone and called Darnell. His uncle answered on the first ring. Almost time, Jerome said. Do it right, not just fast, Darnell replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of financial wisdom. That's the only way I know. After ending the call, Jerome began organizing his materials for Monday's return to work. His desk at the construction firm would look exactly as it always had. His manner would be unchanged. His interactions would remain professional and measured. The surface would show nothing different, while everything underneath was already decided. Like his father before him, Jerome understood that the most important work happened in the quiet spaces between what people thought they saw and what actually existed. Jerome pulled into the company parking lot at exactly 7:15 a.m. Monday morning, the same time he'd arrived for the past 11 years. His work truck, a practical Ford F-150 with the company logo, fit perfectly into his usual spot. Nothing about his appearance or manner suggested anything had changed. Inside, he nodded to the security guard, picked up his messages from the front desk, and walked to his office with the same measured pace he always used. The morning light filtered through the blinds as he settled into his routine, reviewing project timelines and contractor schedules with practiced efficiency. His team filtered in for their regular 8 a.m. meeting. Jerome led the discussion as he always did, working through each item on the agenda with clear direction and calm authority. Only at the end did he address what everyone had likely heard through the office grapevine. I should mention, he said, his voice steady, that Priya and I are separating. I'm handling it, and it won't affect our work here. If anyone needs me, my cell phone remains the same. He moved directly to the next topic without pause. His team exchanged quick glances but followed his lead. There were no awkward questions, no offers of sympathy. Jerome had given them their cue. This was not something that required discussion, and they respected it. Throughout the morning, Jerome maintained his usual rhythm. He reviewed bid proposals, returned calls, and solved the dozen small problems that typically crossed his desk. If anyone noticed that he seemed particularly focused, they likely attributed it to work being his refuge from personal matters. Around 2 in the afternoon, a soft knock came at his door. Adrienne Cross, one of the senior project coordinators, stood in the doorway. Her expression carried the weight of something that needed saying. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. Jerome gestured to the chair across from his desk. Adrienne closed the door behind her and sat down, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice low and controlled. "About a year ago, I was having dinner downtown at Martino's. I saw Priya there. She was with someone, a man. They weren't just having a business dinner." Jerome watched her steadily, letting her speak. "I've carried this for months," Adrienne continued. "I didn't know if I should say anything. I told myself maybe I was reading too much into it, that it wasn't my place." She met his eyes directly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "You're telling me now," Jerome said quietly. "That matters." Adrienne nodded, relief visible in her shoulders. "I just wanted you to know." "I appreciate that," Jerome said. Then he added carefully, "I need to ask you for one favor. If anyone from Priya's legal team, or anyone connected to Victor Ashby, reaches out about my work here, my projects, my client relationships, anything, I'd like you to document it and let me know directly." "Of course," Adrienne said without hesitation. She stood to leave, then paused. "Jerome, you're one of the good ones. I hope you know that." Across town that evening, Priya and Victor sat at a corner table in an upscale restaurant, sharing a bottle of expensive Cabernet. The lighting was soft, the tablecloth pristinely white, the atmosphere precisely what Victor preferred for celebration. "It went exactly according to plan," Priya said, swirling her wine. "You should have seen his face when he realized the locks were changed, standing there in the rain like he couldn't quite process what was happening." Victor smiled, reaching across to touch her hand. "And the attorney?" "Completely confident," Priya replied. "She says the settlement should come through in 4 to 6 months. Clean split, straightforward division of assets." She laughed softly. "Poor Jerome probably thinks he can contest it somehow." Victor raised his glass, the crystal catching the light. In his mind, he was already allocating the expected settlement funds, expansion of the design firm, new office space, perhaps that showroom in Over the Rhine they'd discussed. "To the next chapter," he said smoothly, every word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Priya clinked her glass against his. Victor took a long drink, his expression confident and satisfied. The wine was perfect, the evening was perfect, and the future seemed perfectly arranged before them. He had no idea that the foundation he was building on didn't exist. Jerome sat in his office late Wednesday evening, the building quiet except for the soft hum of the HVAC system. On his desk, 3 folders lay open, each containing documentation from different sources, each telling part of a story Victor Ashby never expected anyone to piece together. His industry contact, Marcus Chen, had delivered the first batch of evidence that morning. Marcus ran business development for one of Cincinnati's largest commercial architecture firms, and had crossed paths with Victor Ashby numerous times over the past 3 years. "I thought it was strange," Marcus had said, sliding the documents across the conference room table at their breakfast meeting. "Victor's firm kept landing these contracts that seemed just outside their usual scope. Then I started hearing your name come up in conversations with clients." Jerome spread out the proposal documents Marcus had gathered. 3 major commercial design contracts awarded to Victor's firm between 2021 and 2023. The Hamilton Tower renovation, the River Point retail complex, the new University Medical Center wing. Combined value, just over $4 million in design fees. In each case, Victor had positioned his firm as having a special relationship with Wade Construction Management, Jerome's employer. He had referenced Jerome specifically in client meetings, suggesting an established partnership that would ensure smooth coordination between design and construction phases. He told the Hamilton Tower people you'd personally overseen 3 of his previous projects, Marcus explained. Said you'd vouch for his firm's capabilities. Jerome made notes in his precise handwriting. 2 of the clients who'd awarded those contracts, Robert McNally at Hamilton Tower and James Chen at River Point, had known Jerome professionally for over a decade. They'd trusted Victor's firm partly because they trusted Jerome's implied endorsement. At 3 o'clock, Phyllis arrived with the financial documentation. They spread the LLC filings across Jerome's conference table, creating a timeline of transactions that told its own damning story. "Look at the vendor invoices," Phyllis said, pointing to a series of highlighted entries. "Everything's inflated by 15 to 20%. The excess gets moved to this holding account, then transferred in smaller amounts to a joint personal account, opened by Victor and Priya 14 months ago." Jerome studied the account opening documentation. The timing was precise. Exactly 2 months before Darnell had spotted them together in Louisville. 4 months before the first forged transfer attempt on the Avondale property. "They've been financially entangled longer than either of them has admitted," Jerome observed quietly. "And they've been sloppy about it," Phyllis added. "The pattern is clear enough that a basic audit would catch it. They clearly weren't expecting anyone to look closely." Jerome moved methodically through each piece of evidence, organizing everything into a comprehensive timeline. Victor had used Jerome's professional reputation to secure contracts worth millions. He had extracted funds through inflated invoices. He had opened joint accounts with Priya, while she was still presenting herself as fully committed to her marriage. The professional fraud is actually worse than the financial irregularities, Phyllis noted. Those contracts were awarded partly based on your implied endorsement. McNally and Chen need to know they were misled. Jerome nodded, thinking of Robert McNally, a man he'd worked with since his early days in construction management. McNally had always operated on the principle that a person's word was their bond. "Have you prepared the notification packages for the clients?" Jerome asked. "Complete and ready to go," Phyllis confirmed. Full documentation of Victor's misrepresentation, copies of the relevant proposal meetings where he invoked your name, timeline of the actual relationship, or lack thereof, between your companies. Jerome closed the last folder and looked at the neat stack of evidence they'd assembled. "We have everything we need on him?" "More than enough," Phyllis said. "The professional fraud alone would severely damage his standing in the industry. The financial irregularities in the LLC might constitute actual criminal fraud, depending on how the prosecutor's office views it. At minimum, it opens him to significant civil liability." Jerome was quiet for a moment, considering the full weight of what they'd uncovered. Then he said simply, "Prepare it all. When we file the divorce response, this goes to McNally and Chen simultaneously. Everything drops at once." "It will be comprehensive," Phyllis assured him. "Victor won't see it coming until it's already done." The diner sat on the corner of Madison and Edwards, a plain brick building that had been serving breakfast to early risers since 1962. Jerome arrived at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the agreed time. The morning crowd was thin, a few regulars at the counter, 2 police officers finishing their night shift meals, a waitress who'd clearly been there since dawn. Jerome chose a booth near the back, positioned so he could see the door. He ordered black coffee and waited, watching steam rise from the cup in steady curls. The coffee was good, strong and honest, like the place itself. Gordon Holloway arrived at 7:02, slightly late, but not enough to matter. He moved through the diner with the hesitant steps of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Jerome recognized the guilt in his posture before Gordon even reached the table. It was there in the too careful way he sat down, in how he wouldn't quite meet Jerome's eyes. "Thanks for meeting me," Jerome said. "Of course," Gordon replied, his tone overcorrected to sound casual. "I was surprised to hear from you." The waitress came by. Gordon ordered coffee with cream and sugar. His hands fidgeted with the paper napkin dispenser while they waited. Jerome had known Gordon for 9 years, had gone fishing with him, helped him move furniture, sat next to him at countless family dinners. Gordon was a decent man in the specific way that made his current discomfort more revealing. He knew something. He'd been carrying it. When the waitress brought Gordon's coffee, Jerome watched him stir it without drinking. 3 slow circles with the spoon. A 4th, still not looking up. "I need to ask you something," Jerome said quietly. "About Priya." Gordon's spoon clinked against the cup. "Jerome, I don't want to get in the middle. When did she tell the family she was leaving?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Gordon's stirring stopped. His shoulders tensed slightly. I try to stay out of—" "Gordon." Jerome's voice remained soft. "I'm not here to put you in anything. I just need to know when." The diner's ambient noise seemed to fade. Just 2 men at a booth, steam rising from coffee cups, and the weight of a truth about to be spoken. Gordon stared into his coffee for what felt like a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 14 months ago. He swallowed. "She told Mom first, then the rest of us at dinner that Sunday. She said she'd already decided." Jerome absorbed this with perfect stillness. 14 months. Before Darnell's warning call about Louisville. Before the forged transfer attempt. Before Jerome had any reason to doubt their marriage was intact. 14 months of ordinary mornings, of discussing paint colors for the guest room, of planning the garden for spring, of Jerome kissing her goodbye before work, of cooking dinner together, of talking about their days. 14 months of her family, knowing it was already over while Jerome built their future alone. "She made us promise not to say anything," Gordon added, as if this somehow helped. "She said she needed time to—" "It's okay," Jerome interrupted softly. He reached for his wallet and placed enough cash on the table to cover both coffees, plus a generous tip. "Thank you for telling me now." He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the diner without looking back. Gordon remained at the booth, staring into his untouched coffee, as if it might offer absolution. Jerome got into the Cullinan and sat perfectly still behind the wheel. The morning sun slanted through the windshield, warming the leather interior. Traffic moved steadily past on Madison. The world continued its ordinary rhythm, while Jerome processed what 14 months really meant. Not the money, not the forgery, not even the affair itself, but 14 months of performing a marriage that existed only for him. 14 months of being alone without knowing it. He sat unmoving for several minutes, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. Then he started the engine, pulled smoothly into traffic, and called Phyllis. "File everything," he said simply. "Tomorrow morning." The hotel suite felt different that evening, more purposeful, like an operating room before surgery. Jerome sat at the dining table with Phyllis Okafor and Margaret Pruitt, his divorce attorney, surrounded by precisely organized stacks of documents. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a backdrop that felt appropriately dramatic for what they were about to set in motion. "Let's confirm the sequence one more time," Margaret said, spreading out a timeline she'd drafted. Her voice carried the steady confidence of someone who had orchestrated complex legal maneuvers many times before. Jerome nodded, his expression calm. "Walk me through it." Phyllis opened her leather portfolio. "At exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow, I file the divorce response with the full financial disclosure. Every asset, every account, every property, $4.2 million in total. All of it properly structured as separate property throughout the marriage. The moment that hits," Margaret added, "Priya's attorney will have to completely reassess their strategy." They filed expecting a modest marital estate under $700,000. This changes everything for them. Simultaneously, Phyllis continued, the forgery documentation goes to the prosecutor's office. We've got the forensic handwriting analysis confirming the Avondale transfer document was falsified. plus the paper trail showing Priya attempted to record the fraudulent transfer. Jerome examined the forensics report one last time. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Pay attention to the details, son. That's where the truth lives." "I'll make the calls to Thomas Reed and Michael Chen myself," Jerome said, referring to the commercial clients whose contracts were won using his name. "They deserve to hear it directly from me." Margaret slid 2 prepared statements across the table. These outline exactly what to say. Stick to the facts. No emotional language. Just that Victor Ashby used your name and professional reputation without consent to secure those contracts. "Thomas will pull immediately," Jerome said with quiet certainty. "He values reputation above everything else." Phyllis moved to the next item. "Once those calls are made, I filed a civil claim regarding the LLC financial irregularities. That will trigger an automatic freeze on the joint account Victor and Priya established 14 months ago. The documentation shows clear patterns of inflated vendor invoices being used to extract cash." Jerome stood and walked to the window, processing each step. The city sprawled below, thousands of lights marking thousands of lives continuing their ordinary course. Tomorrow, 2 of those lives would be fundamentally disrupted. "What about the Avondale tenants?" he asked, turning back to face the attorneys. Margaret checked her notes. "We've drafted a letter informing them that the ownership dispute is being resolved, and they'll receive formal documentation within 30 days. Their leases remain valid and protected throughout this process." "Good," Jerome said. "They shouldn't suffer for other people's choices." They spent the next hour reviewing every document, every filing, every planned action. Jerome asked precise questions, seeking clarity on specific legal language and timing. There was no excitement in his manner, no anticipation of revenge. He approached it like any other project, with thoroughness and attention to detail. As the meeting concluded, Phyllis gathered her files. "Everything is ready, Jerome. At 9 a.m. tomorrow, it all begins." Margaret stood as well. "Try to get some rest tonight. Tomorrow will be intense, even if everything goes exactly as planned." Jerome walked them to the door, thanking them both with quiet sincerity. When they were gone, he returned to the window. The city had grown quieter, but it never truly slept. Neither would he, probably. He thought about the oak tree in front of his former home, about standing in the rain that night, about the look on Priya's face through the 4-inch gap of the chained door. He thought about his father's words again. "Never let a person know the full size of what you've got until you know the full size of who they are." Standing there in the quiet suite, Jerome finally understood. His father hadn't been teaching him to be secretive. He'd been teaching him to be discerning, to watch, to wait, to know for certain before revealing yourself fully. Jerome turned off the light and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would arrive with its own momentum, and everything would change for Priya and Victor. But tonight was for silence, for stillness, for the last quiet moments before consequence. Jerome arrived at the office at 7:45 a.m., his work truck pulling into its usual spot in the employee parking lot. He carried his regular coffee tumbler, nodded to the security guard, and walked to his office with the same measured pace he showed every morning. Nothing in his demeanor suggested this Wednesday would be different from any other. He reviewed project timelines, responded to emails, and conducted his 8:30 team check-in with characteristic focus. The only sign that this was not an ordinary morning was the personal phone sitting silently in his jacket pocket, waiting. At 9:04 a.m., it vibrated once. A text from Phyllis Okafor. Filed. Jerome read it, sent back a simple "confirmed," and returned to his review of a contractor's revised budget proposal. His hands remained steady on the keyboard. His breathing stayed even. He had learned long ago that the most important moments required the least dramatic response. Across town, in her modernly furnished home office, Priya was sorting through design samples when her phone rang. Her attorney's name appeared on the screen. She answered with the casual confidence of someone who believed everything was proceeding according to plan. "We need to meet immediately," her attorney said. The voice carried an unfamiliar note, professional composure barely containing genuine alarm. "Something has been filed that changes our entire approach." Priya arrived at the law office 37 minutes later, her heels clicking purposefully across the marble lobby floor. The receptionist directed her straight back. No waiting, no preliminary small talk. Her attorney was standing when she entered, which was the first sign that something was truly wrong. "Before we discuss anything else," the attorney said, lifting a substantial document from her desk, "you need to read this. It's your husband's financial disclosure response." Priya took the papers with manicured hands that still showed no tremor. She began reading. Then she stopped, started again from the beginning. The numbers refused to make sense, so she read them a third time. $4.2 million in total assets, 11 properties across 3 cities, held in separate LLCs, a 60% silent partnership stake in a commercial development firm, a trust established before the marriage, never disclosed, worth over $900,000, all of it structured as separate property, all of it legally protected, all of it completely unknown to her until this moment. "This isn't possible," Priya said, her voice finally showing strain. "He's a project manager. We have joint accounts. I've seen his paychecks." Her attorney's voice was carefully measured. "What you saw was what he allowed to be visible. The marital estate, the portion you have any legitimate claim to, amounts to approximately $180,000. The house equity and the joint accounts. Nothing else." Priya stood abruptly, gathering her bag. "I need to make a call." In the parking garage, she pressed Victor's number with shaking fingers. When he answered, she described the disclosure in fragmentary sentences, her usual poise cracking. The silence on Victor's end stretched longer with each revelation. She could hear him processing, recalculating, adjusting his understanding of what their future actually contained. Before Victor could respond, her phone buzzed with another incoming call. Her attorney again. "The prosecutor's office has been in contact," the attorney said without preamble. "They're reviewing documentation regarding the Avondale property transfer. Priya, we need to discuss potential criminal exposure." She ended that call only to have another immediately begin. Gordon, her brother, his voice tight with something between guilt and warning. "Mom knows," he said. "Someone called her. She's devastated, Priya. She keeps asking how long you knew you were leaving before you told Jerome." Priya leaned against a concrete pillar in the garage, her designer dress catching on the rough surface. She put Victor back on the line, her voice now openly pleading for reassurance. Instead, Victor said, "I can't have my name connected to a criminal investigation, not with the contracts we have pending." In that moment, standing alone in the cold fluorescent light of an underground parking garage, Priya understood the true nature of what she had built with Victor. Not a partnership founded on love or loyalty, but a transaction based on expected assets that no longer existed. She held her silent phone, surrounded by empty parking spaces, facing a settlement that had evaporated and a criminal referral that was already in motion. She had nothing left to negotiate with, and no one standing beside her. The restaurant stood in Cincinnati's historic district, its limestone facade catching the afternoon light. Jerome arrived 15 minutes early, parking the Cullinan himself. He nodded to the valet, who recognized him not as a guest, but as one of the owners. Inside, the host's face brightened with genuine warmth. "Mr. Wade, always good to see you. Your private room is ready." Jerome thanked him quietly. He had owned 12% of this restaurant for 4 years. The staff knew him as the silent partner, who fixed problems before they became crises and never demanded recognition. He waited in the lobby, hands loose at his sides, watching the street through the front windows. Priya arrived precisely on time, in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She entered with practiced poise, her chin lifted slightly, the way she carried herself in client meetings when she needed to project authority. She saw Jerome first, then noticed how the host immediately approached him rather than her. "Mr. Wade, shall I show you and your guest to your room?" The word "your" landed with precise weight. Priya's step faltered almost imperceptibly. She had prepared for this meeting, believing she still held some advantage of familiarity, some ability to manage Jerome's reactions the way she always had. But this small moment, the host's deference, the private room, the clear indication that Jerome owned some part of this space, disrupted her script before it began. They followed the host through the main dining room, past tables of people who nodded to Jerome with varying degrees of recognition. The private room was in the back, warm wood panels and soft lighting, a single table set for two. Jerome held Priya's chair without ceremony. They sat. Priya spoke first, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had rehearsed their lines. "I know this isn't how either of us wanted things to end. I hope we can handle this like adults. I never meant for it to become—" She trailed off, perhaps realizing that every word sounded hollow in this room that partially belonged to the man she had tried to leave with nothing. Jerome let the silence hold for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and withdrew a single photograph. He placed it on the table between them. Priya and Victor at a Louisville restaurant, time stamped 14 months ago. They were sitting close, his hand on her wrist, both of them laughing at something just said. "I'm not here about the affair," Jerome said quietly. "I've made my peace with what that means about you." He opened a thin folder and began laying out documents one by one. His voice remained steady, almost gentle, as he walked her through each item. The forged property transfer bearing his supposed signature, the LLC financial records showing systematically inflated vendor invoices, bank statements from the joint account she and Victor had opened while she was still living in Jerome's house. He spoke from memory, never once referring to the papers. He had lived with this information long enough to know every detail by heart. "You looked at me for 9 years, he said, "and saw exactly what you expected to see. A salary, a work truck, a modest joint account. You decided that was the whole picture." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "You never asked who I actually was." Priya's hands were perfectly still in her lap, but her breathing had become shallow. The careful script she had prepared was useless against this version of Jerome. This man who spoke with quiet certainty about things she had believed were perfectly hidden. "These clients," Jerome continued, indicating another document, "who were told I would be connected to their projects. They trusted you because they trusted me. That trust wasn't yours to spend." A waiter appeared briefly with water, nodding to Jerome with familiar respect before withdrawing. The moment underscored everything. This was Jerome's space, Jerome's timing, Jerome's truth finally spoken aloud. Jerome stood, straightening his jacket, with the same unhurried movement he had always shown. "I want you to understand that I'm not angry," he said. "I'm clear. Those are different things." He turned and walked out of the private room without looking back. The door closed silently behind him. Priya sat alone at the table, surrounded by documents that mapped the precise shape of her miscalculation. Through the walls, she could hear the muted sounds of the restaurant, Jerome's restaurant, at least in part, continuing its normal service. She did not move for a long time. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to manage, nothing left to perform. The consequences arrived like a tide, steady, inevitable, and permanent. No single wave, but the constant press of water against foundations until what was poorly built simply washed away. The civil settlement landed first. Under the weight of the forgery documentation, Priya's attorney advised her to accept terms that included repaying all rental income extracted during the fraudulent Avondale transfer attempt. The number wasn't catastrophic, but it drained the modest settlement she did receive, her legitimate, equitable share of approximately $180,000 from the joint assets. The prosecutor's office declined to pursue criminal charges, but placed a notation in her record. It followed her, quiet but persistent, appearing in background checks and professional license reviews, like a shadow that never quite lifted. Her design firm felt the shift within weeks. Contracts that had seemed secure began to waver. Clients who had come through Jerome's network found polite reasons to delay renewals. The business didn't collapse dramatically. It contracted, steadily and quietly, until the office that had once hummed with activity fell silent more often than not. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Priya closed the firm's doors. She packed her design portfolios and relocated to Columbus, where no one knew the full story, but everyone seemed to know enough. The community she'd built in Cincinnati, the carefully cultivated relationships, the social circles, the professional alliances, did not follow her. They had been built on Jerome's foundation, and that foundation no longer existed. Victor's unraveling was equally methodical. The 2 major contracts he lost the morning everything broke were just the beginning. One of his remaining clients, reading about the LLC financial irregularities in Phyllis's civil claim, invoked their forensic accounting clause. The audit revealed patterns that raised questions no one could satisfactorily answer. Word traveled in the specific way it does in professional circles, not as gossip, but as quiet warnings passed between decision-makers. Victor's reputation, built over 15 years of strategic relationship cultivation, began to dissolve. He wasn't criminally charged, but at his level, being unhireable was its own sentence. The pressure cracked what he and Priya had built together. Without the promised settlement money, without their shared business vision, without the carefully constructed future they'd planned, they had nothing left to stand on. They separated 6 months after everything fell apart. Jerome learned about their separation from Adrienne, who heard it through industry channels. He was reviewing project timelines when she told him. He said only, "Okay." Then he returned to his work, the same steady focus he'd always shown. 18 months passed like water. Jerome's portfolio grew to 13 properties, the original 11 plus a 14-unit building in Norwood, and a small commercial strip in Dayton he was converting to mixed use. His silent partnership in the Development LLC closed its largest project to date. The firm promoted him to Director of Project Operations. He accepted because he enjoyed the work, not because he needed the salary. His colleagues noted that he seemed more present somehow, as if a weight had lifted that they hadn't known he was carrying. He bought a house, not the one with the oak tree, but a solid craftsman with a deep porch that faced west. The evenings there were long and golden. He planted a Japanese maple in the yard, the kind that turned deep red in fall. He didn't rush its growth. He simply gave it good soil and watched it take root. Celeste came into his life gradually, the way the best things often do. A nurse with direct eyes and patient hands, she laughed at his attempts at jokes even when they didn't quite land. She had a key to his house, but never presumed about what that meant. Jerome hadn't shown her the full picture yet, but he was beginning to think she was someone worth showing. In his home office drawer, he kept one document, the first filing Phyllis had prepared for him, dated the morning after Darnell's warning call. Sometimes he looked at it, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet recognition. This was the moment he chose preparation over hope, action over wishful thinking. On a rain-misted Saturday morning, Jerome stood outside the Norwood property, reviewing a contractor's punch list. The rain fell lightly, more suggestion than substance. He looked up from the papers and thought briefly about another driveway, changed locks, an oak tree. He remembered the specific feeling of standing in the wet dark, trying to find words that wouldn't come. 2 minutes. That's all it had taken then. He walked to the Cullinan parked at the curb and got behind the wheel himself. something he rarely did. The navigation system waited for input. He typed in Darnell's address in Louisville, deciding to surprise the old man. Maybe take him somewhere unreasonably good for lunch. The rain picked up slightly as he pulled away from the curb. The wipers moved across the windshield in their quiet, steady rhythm, clearing the view ahead of everything that had once obscured it. Jerome drove. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.